All right. Well, Ryan, I was thinking about our conversation about personal statement hooks a lot, and while I was thinking about it, I just happened upon a movie trailer for a movie that seemed exciting to me. It's called "You're Cordially Invited." Have you heard of this?
No.
So it has Will Ferrell and Reese Witherspoon, two actors that I like very much. I wouldn't say I love them, but I heard Reese Witherspoon, Will Ferrell, comedy coming out Amazon Prime. I immediately went to the trailer. And so the trailer starts with this scene of Will Ferrell saying, "We're all here to celebrate, so why can't we just celebrate together?" And then there's some woman with a southern drawl at a long table who says, "How sweet was that yet?" And then Reese Witherspoon gets up and she's a little inebriated and she says, "You are literally the best person I know." And then somebody is playing cornhole. She says, "Stop playing cornhole." And I act all this out not because I'm trying to replicate it, but because I'm trying to say none of it made me laugh. I was My thought was, if that's the best the movie can do, then ooh, this seems like it's in trouble. And I bet it's not terrible, but I also bet it's forgettable. But it reminded me precisely of what a personal statement hook is supposed to do, right? In this movie trailer, the person who made it was like hitting all the points that they thought audiences would love, right? Relationships, family, love, like what's not to like, but it just felt so forced. And as a result, it made me think, I don't really want to see this.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described to me almost sounds like it would have been purposefully campy or even like satirical. But it sounds like they were trying to make legitimate jokes. So I don't know what they were necessarily trying to appeal to, but yeah, you're right. A bad trailer can condemn a movie to a poor box office showing, and I think your hook and your personal statement can certainly have the same effect on the admissions committees for sure.
Yeah. So to flesh out the analogy, the metaphors are the best hooks provide intrigue without giving away the whole thing, right? You have to have a hook. If you have a movie without a trailer, nobody's going to go watch that movie. So you should have a hook. You should try. You can't just copy and paste someone else's hook. The trailer has to relate to the rest of the movie. There are elements of the genre that the audience is expecting. If it's a comedy, they're expecting certain elements. If it's a horror film, they're expecting certain elements. So there are types of hooks too, and we'll talk about those, I think. And whether or not your reader is actually going to go see this movie or read the rest of your essay depends a lot on how much they like the hook.
For sure. Yeah, agreed. I was thinking about like the idea of creating a first impression, and I was thinking of how Darth Vader comes out in the original Star Wars movie, and it's so menacing. The door slides open and there's all this fog, and he walks out to this ominous music, and without him even saying a word, he's force choking people. It's so clear, who he is, what his purpose in the movie is, and I think clarity is important in making that first impression too. Like, you don't want to introduce your essay and have someone be like, "Wait, what is this about?" or "What am I supposed to get from this?" Like the vibe and the resonance should be on point. And if you have multiple readers, they should generally agree on what the feeling they're getting from it is. So that just made me think of that movie too.
So let's switch then to the admissions essay genre, and let's take a look at a sample one that you've chosen for us, and let's react. So I'm gonna share my screen. All right. So we're asking our readers and viewers here to put themselves in the shoes of an admissions officer and how they would rate this opening paragraph. So, as a child, I would press my grandfather's stethoscope against his chest, listening intently as he told stories of his journey from a small village in Vietnam to becoming a physician in America. He often reminded me of Hippocrates' words: "Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there's also a love of humanity." I knew even then that I wanted to be a doctor, not just because I admired my grandfather's resilience or because I spent my childhood bandaging stuffed animals, but because I believed, as Hippocrates did, that medicine was a way to give life meaning. So our viewers presumably haven't ever sat on an admissions committee. How should they go about evaluating this?
Well, on one hand, I think there is a clear amount of sort of well intentioned feeling to it, paying tribute to his family members that, or her family members that came before them. And it's trying to show, I think, a change in perspective a little bit, where I had this early introduction to medicine when I was young, and that was the spark. But it's more than just that. That's kind of what the ending of the paragraph's trying to do, is say, like, there's all these reasons. It's not just because my grandfather's a doctor. It's not just because I grew up around it, but it's because I believe this principle so strongly. Probably for someone who's not in the world of admissions, what I would sort of advise them to think about is whether this really feels like an essay that only this person could have written is, I think, an important question to ask yourself. Like, the idea of being entirely original is difficult, but thinking like, is this really the story that only I could have told, or is this something that maybe a lot of other people who are applying could have a similar story? And if you think a lot of other people applying could have a similar story, it's probably not the one you should be telling in your hook.
Okay, so we're suggesting this is a bad hook for a couple of reasons. One, many people could have written this.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's read lots and lots and lots of personal statements, especially for medical school, I think the idea of coming from an immigrant family, having a family member who is a physician, spending your youth playing doctor, and using your parents' stethoscope or something along those lines, those are all things that I've seen many many times, and so those are bad cliches that the admissions committees are probably going to have seen quite often in the past. It's never a great idea, I think, to quote some famous person or historical figure that you don't know. And especially if it's something so on the nose and so common like Hippocrates. I think this hook is almost like a conglomeration of a lot of cliches that I think students need to be aware of that could hurt their essay.
Okay, so no famous quotes in general is a good rule of thumb. Um, is it okay to mention these things elsewhere in the essay? Is the problem that they are all smashed together in the hook?
Yeah, I mean, in general, they're not the most compelling things to talk about at all. But I think if you have autobiographical details that are like this, that you feel are impossible to ignore in telling your story, then we have a phrase that we like to throw around at passports sometimes, which is bury your cliches, which essentially means if you have something that you feel like is a little bit more of a cliche element in your story, definitely save it for more of the middle of the essay rather than having it be the first thing that the admissions committees read. And yeah, so that's what I would say about that. You can probably get away with it, but bury it for sure.
Okay, so this is what not to do. If we want to, if we want to start to think about what kinds of hooks to write or how to write a hook, where should we go next? What's the first thing that somebody should think about?
Well, in a sense, you can kind of think about doing, in a way, the opposite of this. So, this focuses a lot on childhood, whereas a good hook is going to focus more on your recent experiences. So, that's just one thing. Occasionally, someone has a background that is so unusual that it's worth writing a hook about. But that is 1% of people. Most of the time, the most interesting things you have to write about are the things that you've done, at least in college or afterwards. Admissions committees care a lot more about what you've done recently. So that's one thing. Really making sure that the hook focuses on you as an individual. This hook is mostly about his grandfather, her grandfather, and Hippocrates. I don't really learn that much about who this person is or what they've done or what's important to them. So, write about recent things, write about you as an active agent in the story. Make sure you're focusing on showing your value or your impact on other people as well. I would say those are three things that this hook doesn't do that you should really focus on when you're writing your own. So I think there's a lot to learn of what to do based on what this one failed to do.
Yeah, okay, so let's so here are our cliches to avoid, which we just mentioned. And so we now have some brainstorming questions for finding the right hook. Um, we're talking about the three C's: candid, compelling, and convincing in your personal statement. So the first one is any aspect of your background or experiences particularly unusual. These look like real examples from our students. Is that true?
Yes, it's true. And the reason that I put this one first is because if you have it, it's usually the right thing to write about. Um, so it almost it's I think it's sort of, if you're thinking of like a process of elimination of like what's the right hook for me, not everyone is going to have something like this. You know, you can see from the examples, some of them are pretty just unique. Like maybe you'd hear one in several hundred people you talk to. But they get less and less crazy. Like learning to fly a plane before you get your driver's license, that's pretty, unique. Being in Toys R Us commercials when you're a kid, that's pretty unique. But maybe the last one about running a side business as a magician, that's not as out there. Really, anybody hypothetically could have done something a little similar to that. But really, the question to ask yourself is, and to other people who are advising you, is what is the thing that I've done that is probably not on the resume of another candidate in this field. And, if you have something like that, sometimes you just know because it's so unusual. Or sometimes your advisor will learn it about you and they will immediately say, that is it. So I think it's a good first question to ask yourself, but I don't think it should be discouraging to people if they read that one and they go like, "Oh no, I don't have anything like that. I guess I'm just average or boring." That's not the case. There's other ways of finding your hook, but this is sort of the obvious first place to start, I think.
So then let's take a look at a second way to try to find our hook. Have you ever left a group, organization, or community better than you found it?
Yeah, this is probably my favorite one because I think when people ask me what admissions committees want to see, and I have to just kind of give them one quick, concise answer, I tell them they like people who leave things better than they found it, because the implication there is if they take you on as a student, you will presumably, hopefully, have a similar effect on their campus, on their community, on their patients, whatever it happens to be. Plus, it's just kind of not something that everyone has had the initiative or the gumption to do. A lot of people go to their roles, whatever their roles happen to be, and they just fulfill their duties. So another way of thinking about this is like, did you go above and beyond? Did you do something that wasn't just in your job description? And if you have something like this, it's a perfect hook because you're going to immediately show, hey, I'm a change maker, to use kind of a buzzword. I'm a change maker. I'm somebody who can execute ideas from start to finish, leave things better than I found them. And there's a lot of different ways that this can manifest in people's experiences. So the example we have is about a person creating a vaping cessation device. But it doesn't need to be that monumental necessarily. But yeah, always ask yourself if you have that kind of trackable impact in any of your activities, because if you can show yourself as a person of impact or value right away, that's always good.
Yeah, I want to also highlight this particular hook because it's well phrased. The irony wasn't lost on me is a simple sentence that intrigues me. It's intriguing that you realize that, and it's an interesting way to access this story right away. It's we already know what this story is ultimately going to be about, but I'm intrigued to understand more about it and how it came about. So not only is it the topic that we're generating for a hook, like we're talking about the hook as a paragraph, but also we're talking about the hook as like what's the opening line, and both matter.
Yeah, and that's sort of the takeaway that I wrote down for this type of story is like, if you can present something as being sort of surprising, in this case it's ironic, but if you can point out the way that the situation is surprising or that it upends expectations, that's a really good way to, as you said, intrigue the reader and sort of draw them in right away.
Great. All right. So the third question would be, can you share a meaningful experience of you advocating for others?
Yeah, this is one that pretty much everybody has. So, admittedly, it does come up quite a bit. Maybe you're applying to be a doctor and it's a story about you helping a patient at the hospital, or you're applying to go into like speech language pathology and it's about you working with a kid. But it's also kind of tried and true where it's going to be driven by building out the character you're helping a little bit, making it feel like a little bit of a scene, and really letting us know what you did to empower the person, to advocate for them. And I think really what it hinges on a lot is it's best if it's like a person who's a complete stranger. And it's best if it's maybe a situation that made you a little uncomfortable. Those are probably the things that are going to move the needle the most for the admissions committee. But yeah, I mean, you can think of the previous one as sort of more of an impact story, and this one's more of like a value to others story.
Yeah, and so we have our first occurrence of dialogue. So a little bit goes a long way. We have a character that's described here. If you are under HIPAA compliance rules, you can put it in quotation marks. But I generally am in favor of giving somebody a name if they show up in the essay as an important figure. Do you agree?
Yeah, because then otherwise, when you're trying to talk about them later in the essay, you're like, "Oh, the old woman from the hospital" or something, which is so like impersonal. And to be honest, I've had people use names in essays without quotes, and it never has seemed to be a problem. So I think character names are definitely the way to go.
Uh, Great. So that's the third question. Fourth would be, can you nerd out and show your intense interest in a subject?
I think in real life, just in conversation and in writing, people respond very positively to people who can show a genuine passion for something. And I think I call it nerding out because I think what it means to nerd out and really show the genuine passion is to get pretty specific. If someone tells you they like baseball, you're like, okay, whatever. But if they rattle off all these crazy stats and talk about all these nuanced things pitchers do and stuff, you're like, oh, okay, you really, really love this. And I think people respond well to that. They're like, oh, that's interesting. You're telling me something from an insider perspective that I don't know anything about. I'm really believing how much you've invested in this. I think what's kind of cool about this strategy is it doesn't even necessarily have to be something that relates directly to your field. You know, sometimes it can be like I think in this hook it is, where they're talking about taking it apart and putting it back together video games and they get into engineering and things like that. But I've seen totally unrelated topics that are just interesting that are then brought back to the career and the field of interest. One that always sticks out in my mind is this person who wrote about softball coaching, and then she connected it to being a dentist, which doesn't seem at all like it would make sense at first. But really, all you're doing is just starting by letting them get into your head, see what makes you tick, see what you're passionate about, and almost feel like you're telling somebody about this interest, and you're just having a conversation with them. And I find that it works really well.
Yeah, well, I think the example here works really well. The cracking open an old Game Boy is an example of whether in engineering, hardware development, or digital preservation, I want to keep tinkering, innovating, and above all, playing. It's a good example and the kind of thing that would show something about you in a way that saying I love the subject matter just doesn't quite bring to the table.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I also want to draw attention here to the language. Again, cracking open an old Game Boy. There's something deeply satisfying about cracking open an old Game Boy. That's an example of, is that onomatopoeia where it sounds like the thing that it is?
Yeah, it is an onomatopoeia, and it's also just the right kind of word that you want to try to use in these essays, where it's not overly fancy, it's not hard to understand, but it's really apt and really effective at the same time. So
Sure.
you're sort of looking for that mid-level word that anybody could understand but has an impact. And I think you're right, cracking is perfect.
Great. Yeah, yeah. And then the second sentence is he's clearly having fun with the subject matter. The first time I did it, I was armed with nothing but a YouTube tutorial and a questionable screwdriver set. That's fun. And so I would say step one is being able to write in a way that is clear and concise. But step two is leaning into your own voice, and that would include whatever you like to write about or are excited to write about. But in this case, it makes me want to read more. It's part of the hook. The style itself is part of the hook.
Yeah, I mean, I think humor is great, especially if it's at your own expense, because that's usually the
Mm,
best kind. I do tell people writing admissions essays might not seem fun to you, but if you can even have a sliver of fun when you're trying to do this, the readers are going to have more fun when they're reading it. And if you try to have fun, you're more likely to infuse your voice into the essay as well. And I think this also illustrates the importance of taking risks, because somebody could have easily told this student, hey, you're applying for a serious engineering program in graduate school. Like, you're going to open your essay with a Game Boy, man. Like, and that might shut someone down and be like, oh, yeah, you're right. Like, that's not a good idea. But you got to take risks. Like, you got to do stuff that's fun, that makes people smile, that makes people want to talk to you and interview you and work with you. And so there's a lot to be said about just like having fun, taking risks, not being afraid to just really be yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe you don't appeal to the grumpy pants out there, but that's the small portion of the admissions readers. All right. Advice number 5. Can you take an average experience from your field and make it personal?
Yeah. So this is sort of, to me, I think the reason it's kind of last in the list is that it can be a good recourse for people who are still really struggling to find something that works for them. Because essentially what you're doing is you're taking a seemingly average experience and you're kind of finding what the nugget of interest or intrigue is within it. It also is almost an idea of like, can you make things more personally relevant to you? So if you work as someone who educates kids, is there a way to sort of show aspects of your own personal background in the story? Is there a way to show some human element that was unexpected in the story? It's a little bit like the one about advocating for others, but I think it relies more on almost a full circle sort of dynamic where, you know, something about you is now coming full circle in the way that you're helping others.
Yeah, I think most people applying to graduate school eventually figure out the activities they want to be involved in and why those activities matter to them. And it's just a question of how you write about it. So uh, there is a flavor of activity where you're just trying something for the sake of it and you don't have a personal attachment to it. But the ones that matter to graduate programs are the ones that where you are personally invested. So the example here, I could see it in their eyes, the frustration, the exhaustion, the quiet defeat. I just don't get it, my student muttered, staring at the words that refused to cooperate. So this is the example of tutoring somebody in a situation that maybe you had been tutored as a kid.
Yeah, and I think this gets into the element of learning disabilities and things like that, where it's revealed that the writer also went through some struggles with learning disabilities and can now see the kids going through the same thing. And so the stereotype around volunteering, this might sound pretty pessimistic, but I think the stereotype around volunteering is that people do it because they know that they need it for their application. And so I think if you're able to show like, hey, this isn't just something that I grab bagged because I needed it for my resume, this is personally relevant to me, it fits into my story, it's kind of a way of me either paying forward the things that I was given or maybe trying to correct the things that I missed out on. And I think that that's kind of what makes this one powerful. So number 5 overlaps with some of the others here, but I think it's a good thing to think about. Do you have some full circle experience where you're helping someone in a way that you were once helped in?
Yeah, the one point I would make about all these examples are these are all final drafts that have been through multiple revisions with the wording carefully tuned to tell the story. So if you're reading these and think, wow, these are amazing, I would imagine many of the people that wrote them couldn't have just produced this upon rough draft.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the next section that's about the notes on style actually kind of connects to what you just said, because I think even if someone took their original first draft and then asked themselves just a series of questions to improve their style, it would go from pretty rough to pretty good. Maybe not final, but I think what makes a rough draft rough is it's filled with more than what needs to actually be there usually. There's a lot of unnecessary words. I've talked about this many times before, but I think people's high school and college writing classes, like, they just teach you to write a lot. They don't teach you to write well. And it's not anybody's fault necessarily, but it's kind of like everybody just overwrites and overwrites. And that's what usually what editing these essays is keeping what absolutely needs to be there and getting rid of the rest.
The art of being a political science major was turning one sentence into a 5-page essay. So I feel you on that one. So we could talk about style for hours, and it wouldn't probably be very helpful. But it looks like you've collected some of these greatest hits of the things we find ourselves saying to students over and over again.
Yeah, and I think if you're just trying to assess whether like a given paragraph or a given essay has been stylized well enough, like these are sort of questions I would ask myself. Like if you're reading your opening paragraph, have you varied up the length and structure of your sentences? Are you opening way too many sentences with just the I did this, I did that kind of construction? Is every sentence just one big list of things after another big list of things? That's a really common thing. So you don't really think about it all necessarily when you're first starting. You're just trying to get your ideas down. But it is nice to have some sentences maybe could have a list or can have an introductory phrase in the beginning. Maybe you should have some sentences that are just like 3 or 4 or 5 words to make sure you have some punchy stuff amid a bunch of long sentences or things like that. Um, and then active voice and strong verbs is another thing. I think because schooling encourages us to write very long things, we often put in kind of phrases like, oh, I was able to blank. Instead of saying, I was able to shadow a doctor, just say, I shadowed a doctor. Or like, or if you're using too many of the was and were kind of to be verb, the paper was written by a student in the class, just say, a student in the class wrote the paper. Those small things will save you words and characters and make the writing sound more confident and stronger, even if it doesn't necessarily seem like a big deal on the surface. My favorite is probably the adverbs one, just because, like, when I was reading Stephen King's book about how to write, he talks about how, adverbs are these sort of like, pimples and cysts to be like excised from your writing, and how the road to hell is paved with adverbs. He said all these things because the idea is like if your adjectives, nouns, and verbs are strong enough, then you're never going to need an adverb, basically. And the ones that I pointed out are phrases like truly believed, effectively coordinated, and frantically yelled, where there's no reason to put those words in because it's already sort of implied by the verb itself.
Nice.
And so I would say 9 out of 10 times the adverbs can just go if you're looking to like clean things up and make it stronger. Um, Another crime I think people commit sometimes, and I don't think they even do it intentionally, is just using these $100 words when a $1 or $5 one is perfectly fine. They might use a word like ameliorate, where they could just say like fix or improve or something. There's a lot of times where they learn a word and they're excited about it and they want to use it, or they go to their thesaurus and they're just finding fancy words because they think that makes them sound smarter or more sophisticated. And so I just put down 6 examples right there. You can see where some of them are more ridiculous than others, but I've seen all of those kind of words before in essays, and it's a bad sign when someone like me who really loves words reads something and I go, what is that? Your readers should never have an experience of being confused by what you're trying to say. So use simple diction, I think. And am I being as concise as possible? That just points out some um, mistakes people make. I don't think you ever need to say I think or I believe or I feel that or in order to. These are all sort of just filler phrases that um, once you're made aware of them, you almost can't unsee them. And you'll start noticing that they're great ways to cut characters and to make your writing stronger. So I think focusing on these style things in the beginning is nice because as you're going through the process of doing the entire personal statement, these things can just kind of be on your mind. But they're they're especially important for your first paragraph too. Like they might be a little bit more forgivable deeper into the essay to have some of these kind of things, but the first paragraph should read like it's been heavily vetted and heavily cleaned.
Mm.
You said something recently, Rob, where you were like, oh, if this is the thing that the person has spent so much time carefully writing and carefully crafting and they think is worth my time, and then I look at it and I can immediately see all these flaws or all these flubs, then it'll not show the tender loving care that you want it to.
That's how I came round to that idea of the movie preview is you have 90 minutes, probably longer with movies these days. You have 3 hours worth of footage to show me, and that's the scene that you lead with. And it's like, all right, well, I guess I'm not going to read the rest of your essay. Let me show you one tool that I find helpful for this kind of work. The writing in this first paragraph is not bad, but I'll use this as an example. It's called Hemingway app. And so in general, I'm skeptical of tools that claim to make your writing better. Let me share the specific Hemingway editor here. But Hemingway editor, I don't recommend signing up for their whatever their AI based thing is, or whatever this fixed grammar plus is. But you can just copy and paste your writing in, and it'll highlight things that are either very hard to read, or hard to read, or they call them weakeners. It looks like an adverb is a weakener, passive voice is a weakener, and then if there are any words with simpler alternatives.
Hemingway as a writer is sort of famous for these sort of short, simple sentences. And so that's probably the biggest lesson to take away from him is how sparse his writing is, but also so carefully chosen. I don't know if you can get away with some of what he said about 7/8 of what you're saying should be below the surface. I don't know if you want to do that in a personal statement, like Hemingway's iceberg principle. He did not want to come across as a tryhard with his like flowery big sentences, and I think that's what you want to take away from him.
Yeah, I think even weak writers can cut unnecessary words, and
Oh yeah.
that's the obviously we get the occasional student who is a very strong writer and has a distinct voice and can have a lot of fun with words, but that is unusual for us. And so for somebody to get to that point requires years of development and study and reading and just things that are not going to be possible for that student in the short window in which they have to write admissions essays. So the most direct way to make your writing better is to emulate Hemingway. And so this app has been around for a decade or more. I've been using this for a long, long time. And I think it's a really nice way to just sanity check your work. Make sure not everything is highlighted red or orange. Alrighty, just to conclude our discussion about hooks, I think big picture takeaways. In my mind, definitely try to have some sort of hook. If you don't, it's a missed opportunity at worst, and or at best, and at worst, it makes me think you can't write a hook. You're not interesting. You don't care about your reader. If you write a hook, maybe don't try too hard. Follow some of our questions to help guide you with what to say.
Yeah, we have the 5 examples, the 5 good examples that were on the screen share, and you can find lots of other examples too. And you want to read a lot of hooks, whether they're in personal statements or whether they're in books, or just see, oh wow, that really grabbed me, and think about why, because probably you can use those as models where you don't do the same thing but you take its conceit, you take its idea, and then you make it your own. And I think, yeah, you can't really do this without a hook, an opening story that grabs attention. I think, you have to do that. And I think if you focus on your value and your impact on others and having fun and trying to think about this is really only something that I could have written, whether that's the event or that's your voice, I think those are the things that I would really push the hardest.
Great. Well, thanks as always, Ryan.
Of course.